The disappearance of 17-year-old Jessica Aldridge shook the sleepy town of Greenville to its core. Greenville was a quiet place, nestled in the heartland of rural America, where everyone knew everyone. Jessica, a well-liked high school student, lived an unremarkable life until the day she vanished without a trace. On the morning of September 12, 2023, she failed to show up for her usual classes at Greenville High, sparking immediate concern among her family and friends. By evening, a frantic search had begun. Her mother, Susan Aldridge, reported Jessica missing within hours of realizing her daughter had not returned home. Sheriff Ed Spark, a seasoned officer with more than 20 years of experience in Greenville, was assigned the case. Spark was no stranger to handling minor disturbances in the town, but the disappearance of a teenage girl felt different, darker. As the hours turned into days, the search expanded. Volunteers combed the woods and law enforcement agencies were called in to assist. On the 5th day of her disappearance, the search came to a tragic conclusion. Jessica's lifeless body was found, washed ashore by the lake, a few miles from town. Her face was bruised, her clothes soaked, and her hands appeared to have clawed desperately at something before she died. The sight of her body on the cold lake shore sent shockwaves through Greenville, forever marking the town as the place where innocence died. Sheriff Spark stood over her, gazing at the water as a sense of dread washed over him. He had seen enough to know this was no accident. The autopsy confirmed what Spark already suspected. Jessica had been strangled, and her body left in the water post-mortem. Whoever had done this had tried to stage the scene, making it look like an accidental drowning, but there was no mistaking the brutal force behind her death. The lake, normally a spot for peaceful fishing and family picnics, now bore the weight of the town's darkest secret. The pressure on Spark intensified as the media caught wind of the case. Greenville had never been the center of such attention. Reporters lined the streets, hounding citizens for information. The town's residents, terrified and devastated, turned to Spark for answers. But with no witnesses and few clues, the sheriff was working against a ticking clock. The first 48 hours were critical, and they had long passed. Spark knew they needed a suspect, fast. All eyes turned to Mark Luger, Jessica's boyfriend of 2 years. Luger, a brooding 19-year-old with a history of minor run-ins with the law, was known for his temper. He had recently gotten into a public argument with Jessica, witnessed by several classmates. The breakup, which occurred just days before her disappearance, was messy. As Spark interviewed Luger, suspicion mounted. He was evasive, defensive, and at times hostile, raising red flags with the investigators. His history, coupled with his recent fight with Jessica, made him the prime suspect in her murder. But despite the growing suspicion surrounding Luger, something about the case didn't sit right with Spark. The signs of a staged drowning, the methodical disposal of the body, it didn't match Luger's profile. While Luger was hot-headed, Spark doubted he had the cunning to plan such a precise cover-up. Still, with no other suspects in sight, the investigation seemed focused on proving what everyone in town already believed: Mark Luger had killed Jessica in a fit of jealous rage. Sheriff Ed Spark continued his investigation, focusing his attention on Jessica's final days. Greenville's police force, small and unequipped for large-scale operations, struggled to keep pace with the mounting pressure. Spark's gut told him they were missing something crucial. Despite Mark Luger being the primary suspect, the sheriff wasn't convinced. There were gaps in Luger's alibi, but something deeper felt off, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. A thorough search of Jessica's home turned up no new leads. Her bedroom, still frozen in time, painted the picture of a typical teenager: posters of pop stars, school textbooks, and half-finished homework assignments. However, it was her laptop that caught Spark's attention. The device had been left open on her desk, as though she had been using it shortly before she disappeared. Spark ordered a forensic analysis, hoping to find some clue in her digital life. Jessica had been a regular presence online, like most teenagers, but something caught the investigator's eye. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had been communicating with an unidentified individual on an obscure chat platform. And Chopper. The messages were cryptic but pointed to a relationship beyond simple friendship. The conversations were riddled with tension, suggesting that Jessica had been speaking to someone she knew from her past. The account's username, siege_1985, gave them little to go on. Further examination revealed that the chats had increased in intensity in the days just before her disappearance. Jessica had been talking about meeting up with this person, whoever they were, by the lake on the night she went missing. Alarm bells rang for Spark. The lake where Jessica's body was found wasn't just a random location, it was intentional. Whoever she_1985 was, they had drawn her to the very place she would meet her death. Investigators traced the IP address to a nearby town, less than an hour's drive from Greenville. It was then that the focus of the investigation began to shift. While Mark Luger remained a suspect due to his volatile nature and the timing of their breakup, this new lead opened a much darker possibility. Jessica had been meeting someone in secret, a person who had gone unnoticed by everyone close to her. Sheriff Spark knew they had stumbled upon a pivotal moment in the investigation. If Chi_1985 could be identified, they might be looking at Jessica's true killer. So the discovery reignited the investigation, but also brought a new level of complexity. It wasn't just about who had killed Jessica anymore, it was about why she had kept this part of her life hidden. Greenville, now consumed by the murder investigation, grew more restless. Mark Luger, still under suspicion, was repeatedly questioned. But even as Spark focused on him, a nagging doubt persisted. The anger and jealousy Luger had displayed didn't fit the methodical way Jessica's body had been disposed of. The clues were pointing somewhere else, to someone much more deliberate. Spark's mind circled back to the messages, cryptic exchanges that now held the key to unraveling the mystery of Jessica Aldridge's death. The killer was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and as Spark would soon learn, they were closer to Jessica than anyone had ever imagined. Sheriff Ed Spark was haunted by the digital footprints Jessica Aldridge had left behind. The username C_1985 was their strongest lead, but it was still just an anonymous handle. Spark ordered a deeper dive into the chats, hoping for anything that could provide a breakthrough. As the investigation team combed the conversations, one recurring topic stood out: memories from summer camp 10 years ago. Whoever CI_1985 was, they had shared that time with Jessica, making this connection far more personal than anyone had initially realized. Jessica had attended a summer camp as a child, a popular spot for local kids from Greenville and nearby towns. The camp had long since closed, but Spark dug into old records, hoping to identify who C_1985 might be. After sifting through lists of attendees, one name matched the initials: Clayton Johnson. He had attended the same camp as Jessica when they were both just 7 years old. Clayton Johnson had moved away from Greenville with his family shortly after that summer, but the records showed he had returned to the area only a few years ago. His reappearance in town hadn't raised any eyebrows. He was quiet, kept to himself, and hadn't crossed paths with Jessica publicly since his return. That is, until now. Spark's gut tightened. This wasn't some random online predator. Jessica had known Clayton since childhood, and it seemed their paths had crossed again in secret. The fact that she hadn't told anyone about him, her friends, her family, not even her boyfriend Mark Luger, suggested that Jessica had been hiding more than just an innocent friendship. But why? And how had this rekindled relationship taken such a deadly turn? As Spark pieced together more of the puzzle, the forensic team retrieved deleted messages from Jessica's laptop. In these exchanges, Clayton's tone had grown increasingly erratic. At first, the chats were nostalgic, filled with memories of their shared childhood, but they quickly took a darker turn. Clayton had developed an obsession with Jessica, one that had intensified over time. In the days leading up to her death, he had pressured her to meet in person, growing angry when she hesitated. Jessica's responses were careful, even fearful, as if she didn't know how to handle the situation. She had tried to distance herself, making excuses, but Clayton's insistence wore her down. The final messages revealed a chilling reality: Jessica had agreed to meet him at the lake on the night she disappeared. She hadn't told anyone, likely out of fear or confusion, but that decision sealed her fate. Sheriff Spark knew the significance of this discovery. Mark Luger was no longer the prime suspect. The case now revolved around Clayton Johnson, a figure from Jessica's past, who had returned with deadly intentions. But there was still one missing piece. How had a childhood friend turned into a killer? And what exactly had happened on that fateful night by the lake? As the investigation shifted focus, Spark sought out any information about Clayton's recent life. It turned out that, since returning to the area, Clayton had led a solitary existence, rarely engaging with the community. He worked a series of odd jobs, living in a rented room on the outskirts of Greenville. Neighbors described him as quiet, a bit of a loner, but no one had suspected he harbored such dark tendencies. Park realized time was running out. Clayton had already slipped under their radar once, and now that the police were closing in on him, he could disappear again, this time for good. A warrant was issued for Clayton Johnson's arrest, but finding him proved to be more difficult than expected. His residence was empty, and it was clear that he had fled. It seemed Clayton knew the net was closing around him, and he wasn't going to wait to be caught. The hunt for Clayton Johnson now consumed every resource the Greenville Police Department had. With every passing hour, the tension mounted. Jessica's killer was out there somewhere, and the longer he stayed free, the more dangerous he became. To the media, once focused on Mark Luger, now shifted its attention to the new suspect. Clayton's name hit the headlines, and his face was plastered across news outlets, a stark contrast in the quiet, reclusive figure he had once been. Greenville, still reeling from Jessica's death, was now gripped by fear. If Clayton had killed once, could he do it again? For no one knew what he was capable of now that he was on the run. As the manhunt stretched into its second day, a break came when a witness reported seeing a man matching Clayton's description at a gas station off a rural highway. Security footage confirmed it was him. Clayton had been heading north, likely trying to leave the state. But the trail went cold again after that brief sighting. It seemed that Clayton had planned his escape carefully, staying off main roads and avoiding any traceable digital activity. Sheriff Spark couldn't help but feel a mounting sense of frustration. They were always one step behind. Amid the chaos of the search, Spark revisited the evidence they had collected so far. He was haunted by the last few messages between Jessica and Clayton. In those final words, Clayton had professed his love for her, an obsessive, delusional love that had clearly warped his perception of reality. He believed Jessica belonged to him, and when he found out about her relationship with Mark Luger, something inside him had snapped. It was clear that Clayton's obsession had driven him to kill, but what Spark still couldn't shake was the methodical way in which the crime had been committed. Clayton had planned the meeting, strangled Jessica, and staged the scene to make it look like an accident. This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment, it was a premeditated murder. As Spark continued to piece together the timeline, the true horror of what had happened that night began to emerge. Clayton had likely gone to the lake, hoping to rekindle the bond he and Jessica had shared as children. But when she rejected him, when she told him she was with Mark, it had been too much for him to bear. In his twisted mind, if he couldn't have her, no one could. Sheriff Ed Spark couldn't stop thinking about the meticulous planning behind Jessica Aldridge's murder. The act wasn't impulsive. Despite the anger and obsession Clayton Johnson harbored, he had lured her to the lake, prepared to either win her over or silence her forever. The idea that a childhood friend could commit such a cold and calculated crime lingered in Spark's mind as he stared at the investigative board, filled with photos of Jessica and timelines of Clayton's movements. The media frenzy intensified, turning Greenville into a microcosm of fear and speculation. News vans lined the streets, while reporters dug into Clayton's past, hoping to unearth any signs of a troubled history that might have predicted such violence. But there was little to find. Clayton had lived an unassuming life since returning to the area. No criminal record, no history of mental illness, no violent tendencies. He had simply drifted through life until his obsession with Jessica had been rekindled. As Spark's team continued to search for Clayton, the sheriff delved deeper into the psychology of the crime. He consulted a forensic psychologist who specialized in criminal behavior. Together, they began to understand the profile of Clayton Johnson, someone who had likely carried an unspoken infatuation with Jessica for years, nursing his feelings in secret. As children, Clayton and Jessica had shared a bond at summer camp, but while Jessica moved on with her life, Clayton's feelings festered, growing darker and more dangerous. When Clayton reconnected with Jessica online, it was more than just nostalgia, it was an opportunity to finally act on those long-buried emotions. The psychologist explained that in cases like this, the obsession becomes the driving force, warping reality. For Clayton, the past had become an idealized version of Jessica, and when she rejected him, his world collapsed. That's when his obsession turned deadly. Sheriff Spark also revisited Mark Luger's involvement. Though initially the prime suspect, Mark had now become a peripheral figure in the investigation. Still, the events leading up to Jessica's death couldn't be ignored. In his interviews, Mark revealed the strain their relationship had been under in the weeks before her murder. Jessica had grown distant, secretive, and Mark assumed it was just the typical challenges of young love. But Spark now knew that Jessica had been pulled into a dark, secret world with Clayton, unable to extricate herself from the mounting pressure. Mark's jealousy had fueled his anger, but it wasn't enough to make him a killer. In fact, the messages between Jessica and Clayton painted a more complex picture. Jessica had confided to Clayton about her strained relationship with Mark. It had likely given Clayton a false sense of hope, making him believe Jessica might leave Mark for him. But when it became clear that wasn't going to happen, Clayton had lost control. Investigation turned another corner when Spark received an urgent call from a nearby police department. A car matching Clayton Johnson's vehicle had been found abandoned in a wooded area, about 50 miles north of Greenville. It was parked near an isolated hiking trail far from any town or main road. Spark immediately knew this could be their chance to catch Clayton before he disappeared for good. Spark and his deputies raced to the scene, coordinating with the local authorities to set up a perimeter. The location was remote, and Clayton had likely chosen it as a place to either hide or flee deeper into the wilderness. Spark wasn't taking any chances. As they closed in on the vehicle, the sheriff's mind churned through every possibility. Was Clayton armed? Would he try to resist arrest? Or worse, would he take his own life rather than face the consequences of what he had done? When they reached the abandoned car, they found it empty, but a small trail of footprints led into the woods. A search team was quickly assembled, fanning out across the dense forest in search of their suspect. Tension mounted as the daylight began to fade. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity as they moved deeper into the thick underbrush. Suddenly, one of the deputies radioed in. There had been a sighting of someone matching Clayton's description moving along the edge of a nearby stream. Spark's heart pounded as he and his team rushed toward the location, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they neared the stream. They found him huddled near the water's edge, looking disheveled, his clothes dirty from days on the run. Clayton didn't try to flee. In fact, when he saw the officer approaching, he simply raised his hands in surrender. His face was pale, eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear. The man who had once been Jessica's childhood friend now sat in cuffs, looking utterly broken. As Sheriff Spark approached, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. They had their suspect, but the truth of what had happened to Jessica had already stained the town forever. Clayton Johnson, who had once been an innocent boy playing by the lake with Jessica, had turned into a murderer by the same waters a decade later. The nightmare had ended, but it left a scar on everyone involved. Back at the Greenville police station, Clayton Johnson sat in an interrogation room staring blankly at the wall. His capture had been quiet, almost anticlimactic, after days of evading law enforcement. Now, with nowhere left to run, he faced the reality of his actions. Sheriff Ed Spark entered the room, feeling the weight of the moment. This was at the final confrontation. It was time to hear Clayton's side of the story, to understand how a childhood connection had turned so deadly. Spark sat across from Clayton, who remained silent, his hands still trembling slightly from the cold and exhaustion. The sheriff let the silence hang between them for a moment, giving Clayton the opportunity to speak first. But when he didn't, Spark began the process of unraveling the story that had brought them both to this point. Clayton was cooperative, though at times he seemed disconnected from the gravity of what he had done. He admitted to reconnecting with Jessica online, painting their interactions as innocent at first. He had been lonely, he explained, and finding Jessica again felt like a lifeline. As their conversations deepened, his feelings for her resurfaced, stronger than ever. He confessed to becoming fixated on the idea that they were meant to be together. When Jessica told him about Mark Luger, Clayton's obsession began to take a darker turn. He described the jealousy he felt, the anger that simmered beneath the surface. In his mind, Jessica belonged to him. She always had, ever since that summer at camp. Her relationship with Mark felt like a betrayal, and as his frustration grew, so did his determination to win her back. Clayton recounted the night of the murder with eerie calmness. He had arranged to meet Jessica by the lake, convinced he could make her see that they were meant to be. But when she arrived, things didn't go as planned. Jessica was nervous, distant, and when she told him once and for all that she wasn't going to leave Mark, something inside him snapped. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Clayton muttered, staring down at his hands as if they held all the answers. "I just wanted her to listen, to understand." But Jessica hadn't listened. She had tried to leave, and in that moment, Clayton had reached out, grabbing her, desperate to hold on to the connection they once had. What happened next was a blur of rage and confusion. Clayton described the struggle, the way Jessica fought against him, how her cries echoed in the night air. In his mind, it wasn't murder. It was an act of desperation, a last-ditch effort to keep her with him. But as her body went limp in his hands, reality came crashing down. Panic had set in. He dragged her lifeless body to the water, hoping that by staging an accidental drowning, he could cover up what he had done. He hadn't thought it through, hadn't realized that the truth would come out sooner or later, and when Jessica's body was found, he knew his life was over. As Clayton's confession poured out, Sheriff Spark listened, the sense of closure bittersweet. Jessica Aldridge had been killed not by a monster lurking in the shadows, but by someone she had once trusted, a boy who had grown into a man with a dangerous obsession. As Clayton Johnson's confession spilled out, the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Sheriff Ed Spark watched the young man, now a hollow shell of the person who had once been a friend to Jessica Aldridge. Clayton's admission painted a clear picture. This wasn't the crime of a cold-blooded killer, but of a broken mind consumed by obsession and delusion. Yet that didn't lessen the horror of what had happened. Jessica was still gone, her life stolen in a senseless act of violence. The interrogation ended with Clayton quietly signing a full written confession. As the sheriff collected the papers, he felt a strange emptiness. The investigation had been solved, but no sense of victory accompanied the moment. Instead, there was only the grim reality of a tragedy that could not be undone. Word of Clayton's capture spread quickly through Greenville, and as the truth about Jessica's murder came to light, the town was thrust into a new wave of grief and disbelief. The media swarmed, hungry for every detail, but the townspeople were drained, emotionally exhausted by the weight of it all. The narrative had shifted from the simple story of a jealous boyfriend to something far more unsettling. The hidden dangers of a past friendship turned deadly. Mark Luger, once the primary suspect in the center of public scrutiny, was released from custody, but the damage had already been done. His reputation had been dragged through the mud, his innocence questioned by nearly everyone, and even though his name was cleared, he struggled to shake the stigma that had followed him. The pain of losing Jessica remained, compounded by the betrayal of knowing that it wasn't a stranger or even an out-and-out killed her, but someone she had once known and trusted. In the days following Clayton's arrest, the town held a memorial service for Jessica. Hundreds gathered by the lake where she had been found, a place once known for its serene beauty, now tainted by the darkness of her death. Her friends, family, and classmates all came together to remember her not as a victim, but as a bright, kind, and vibrant young woman whose future had been stolen far too soon. As Sheriff Sparks stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the community grieve, he couldn't help but feel the deep sense of loss that permeated the air. He had solved the case, but no amount of justice could bring Jessica back. The answers, while important, felt hollow in the face of such devastation. Clayton Johnson was charged with first-degree murder and held without bail as he awaited trial. His defense team hinted at a plea of temporary insanity, but Spark knew that wouldn't change the outcome. Clayton's actions, regardless of his mental state, had irrevocably altered the course of so many lives. The case may have been closed, but the effects of the crime lingered like a shadow over Greenville, reminding everyone that even in the quietest of places, tragedy could strike without warning. Months passed and Clayton Johnson's trial became a spectacle for the media, though it offered little in terms of new revelations. But his defense team leaned heavily into his deteriorating mental state, portraying Clayton as a deeply disturbed young man whose obsession with Jessica had driven him to the brink. Psychologists testified about his delusions, explaining how Clayton had built up an idealized version of Jessica in his mind, one that could never be real. In the end, it didn't matter. Clayton was found guilty of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Courtroom was packed the day the verdict was read, and though justice had been served, there was no real sense of closure. Jessica's family wept quietly as the gavel struck, their lives forever altered by a crime that no sentence could ever truly fix. Greenville, a town that had once prided itself on being a peaceful haven, slowly began to recover, though the memory of Jessica's death would never truly fade. The lake, once a beloved local spot, became a place to be avoided, haunted by the memory of what had happened there. For years, children would be told not to play too close to the water, as if something malevolent lingered there, waiting to claim another life. Mark Luger left town shortly after the trial, unable to escape the painful memories of losing Jessica. He had been her boyfriend, her confidant, and for a time a suspect in her murder. Despite his innocence, he couldn't shake the weight of guilt, wondering if there had been something he could have done, some sign he should have seen. Greenville had become a place of ghosts for him, and he needed to leave to find peace. As for Sheriff Ed Spark, the case left its mark on him, too. He had seen plenty of death in his career, but this one was different. Jessica Aldridge had been just a kid, with her whole life ahead of her. Her murder wasn't just another case, it was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly innocence could be shattered. The sheriff continued his work, but he found himself more cautious, more protective of the town he served. He had promised to keep Greenville safe, and Jessica's case had shown him just how difficult that promise could be. The years rolled on and life in Greenville returned to a semblance of normalcy mounts. But every time someone passed the lake, they would remember Jessica Aldridge, the bright, talented girl who had been taken too soon. The town would never forget her, nor would they forget the twisted path of obsession and madness that had led to her death. In the end, The story of Jessica Aldridge became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how even the most unassuming lives could be touched by darkness. Though Clayton Johnson sat behind bars, the scars of his actions remained, etched into the hearts of those who had loved Jessica, and into the soul of a town that would never be quite the same again. Greenville moved forward, but the memory of Jessica and the tragedy of her death would never fade entirely. It had become part of the town's fabric, a reminder of the secrets that can hide in the past and the dangerous consequences they can bring when they resurface.